Hi, this is Ken Boa, and I want to welcome you to the Think on These Things video series that we're doing. It's really in two versions. One is a webinar in which I give you a 10 to 15 minutes overview of a topic that we're working through. And tonight we're going to be talking about the question of whether God exists. We're going through a series in this Think on These Things webinar on my book, God, I Don't Understand. I'm glad you asked. And there's 12 basic objections that we've seen with that. So what I'm going to be doing is handling it that way. And then we're going to open up for Q&A. Now, I want to give you a warning, though, before we begin. And the warning is that I'm going to be going through a lot of visuals, quite a number of these visuals. And as I zip through them, my plan is not to actually give you details because I would never have enough time, but I'm giving you a visual impression. And then you can always go to the Think on These podcasts, these Think on These Things podcasts or it's going to be posted on our website, reflections.org, and it's also at lightningsource.com.org rather. So that's what we're going to be doing. So don't try to take notes, but you can always get the details later on as you see the podcast. So with that in mind, I'm going to begin this journey and see what we can do together. So let's take a quick launch then. First of all, then the question is there really a God? And this image from the Sistine Chapel raises this question. And there are three basic options that you have. Of course, no, which is the position of atheism, and there's hard and soft forms of atheism as there are with agnosticism, maybe. And then the third is yes, some kind of a theistic vision of what that looks like. And so the first option, God does not exist, then comes to mind. And this raises the question, how do you know that God does not exist? You'd have to have all knowledge to know, because if you look at a chart of how much, all the knowledge, if you were really, this guy is really being bold and making a dart that large, because it's an absurdity to suppose that we have any fraction, but you'd have to be God to know that God doesn't exist, and there's your problem. We only use a small percentage of our total mental capacity. And the reality is 100% is a paltry fraction of 100 of all knowledge. So I can't say I know he doesn't exist. You'd have to be omniscient. You have to be God to know that he doesn't exist. But then this raises the question of meaning. If there's no God, then there's also no meaning. So it may solve one problem, but it actually leads to further problems, that your life is an episode between two oblivions. You are not existing there and you won't exist there. Your episode between two oblivions. Is that what it is? And is that all there is? As we raise the question, our food for the worms. And so we ask this question, what if there is no God? Then there would really be no basis for human purpose, because an impersonal universe can't have purpose or plan. It would only go toward decay, disorder, and death. It would be Macbeth told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And that all of our aspirations would be mocked by total silence, because the universe is silent and indifferent. Few have come to grips, really, I think, with the logical implications of atheism, and that no atheist, I claim, can live consistently with the logical implications of those conclusions. That is to say, the non-believer lives better than their worldview would say. They live as if there is meaning and value and truth, even though the world does not provide for it. And that's what I mean by this concept here. So ultimately, then, if God is dead, that we're as good as dead, and that's the whole question. So the question of may exist would be a far more realistic and reasonable approach to take, rather than trying to prove a universal negative. Agnosticism, but is it a virtue? We've in our time actually tried to virtuize a non-decision atheism or agnosticism, but it's not a question of, as we'll see separately, is whether science has rendered God unnecessary. Some view agnosticism as a virtue, but a man persuaded against his will is of the same opinion still. Even if you can show a person, they still would hold on to it. And of course, science, faith, and reason, actually, the whole point of empirically based science was developed only at one time in the history of humanity, and that was during the Western vision of a theistic universe in which God made the world and made us such that we, bearing his image, could understand it. So it's not, there are many forms of knowledge that are not attainable by knowledge. It'd be foolish to say that not all knowledge is scientific, because that would be scientism. Rather, you can see that there are various other kinds of knowledge. There's historical knowledge, there's philosophical knowledge, there's moral knowledge. aesthetic knowledge, personal knowledge, and religious knowledge. Polanyi talks about the personal or the tacit dimension. And so none of these can be imperious and claim they have all forms of knowledge. So it would be crazy to suppose that all knowledge is to be diminished by scientific knowledge. And when we come to court, when we consider how do we adjudicate our evidence, it's based upon evidence, based upon legal historical proof. Not scientific proof or demonstration, because nothing can be actually proven in the final sense except in pure mathematics. A preponderance of credible evidence in civil cases is required, but conviction beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal cases, never beyond a shadow of a doubt. You can't get it in this, and everybody lives by faith, and it's very important for us to remember this. The atheist as well as the theist lives as much by faith as anyone else, because at the end of the day they cannot prove their position, so they have to take these things. And that's why I say again that the atheist actually lives in a way that's consistent, more consistent with the theistic implications than with an atheistic understanding. But it doesn't have to be exhaustive evidence, but sufficient. So what are the direct evidences of the senses and the indirect evidence of causality of effect? So you have basically the whole idea of empiricism on the one hand and rationalism on the other. That to say that a sufficient cause must exist to account for the effects of the universe. And we look at certain, I'm limiting to myself to just a handful, order and design, personal beings. How do we account for those things and for morality? So once again, we have to see that the basic question of all is, why is there anything rather than nothing, something rather than nothing? Why does anything exist at all? Leibniz and Sartre raised this question. But once again, the real question of why even live is a question that they cannot consistently live with, because they would then not live. So the idea then is that there's an if proposition. If anything now exists, something must be an illusion, or else something it must be eternal, or something must have emerged from nothing. It's either an illusion that it was an eternal, it emerged from nothing, or was created by an eternal being. So if we go through these ideas, the first possibility is, okay, maybe what we say exists doesn't exist, and taking a more Eastern notion of the whole idea of the appearance of reality, but without the actual illusion. It's Lila, it's Maya, it's a God's play. But this is again not a thing that we can consistently claim. To say it's an illusion lacks empirical evidence. It's an objective fact that there are no facts, and this sentence is incorrect. It lacks correspondence with reality. You have to reject all your evidence from the five senses, and no one really can live at all consistently with such a position. It's impossible. The next possibility is that the universe is eternal. Even if a person, as I said before, who thinks the universe is an illusion, he's very consistent with not looking both ways before he crosses the street. So again, he lives better than this philosophy. The eternal nature of the universe can be seen in a variety of ways, by cosmogony, by the amount of hydrogen, and by the second laws of thermodynamics. But what we're looking at here is it's a contingency, because it is in fact something that we know the best science is now showing that the universe had some beginning, even though they're trying to fudge and find something that comes from nothing. So the Big Bang theory has become largely the idea of variations of it, but essentially there is evidence that shows that there was a beginning of space, time, matter, and energy. The abundance of hydrogen, it shouldn't be so much if it was that old, and for irreversible decay of the universe. Again, we'll look at these in other sessions. But there's what you're dealing with is inference to the best explanation, and that's what I want you to consider. The true best approach is always, what's the best explanation of this? You see a turtle on a fence post. Was it there because it had to be there? Certainly not. Was it there because it was blown up by a storm? I wouldn't put my money on that one. Well, did someone put it there? So if you eliminate the idea of some intelligent causality or an agency, you've eliminated the whole area prematurely of a possible solution, which makes no sense. So we go back in here and consider scientific reasons, and the idea of universe, nothing comes from nothing. It's an absurdity. Effects cannot exist without a cause. Space, time, matter, and energy then actually began, and all the evidence points to that, even though they're trying desperately to come up with things like the quantum flux or these other ideas of some kind of gravity or space. They're cheating. It's not nothing. You're giving me something that actually is, and it doesn't work that way. It was created by an eternal being is a far better posture to take. And we have now the only remaining option. But then the question is going to be who caused God? And it's a category blunder, because you're asking, you're putting God in the category of the creation, and that's a category error. He's the uncaused. He's the one who is the uncaused. That is to say, he exists as in and of himself. His existence and his essence are one and the same. So it's not a contingent, because the universe is an entire contingency. It's a closed system without God. And ultimately, the only sufficient is something that's an eternal and necessary being, not a contingent being. And God as the necessary being means that I am that I am. He is incapable of not being. Whether or not anything exists, he doesn't have to create anything to exist. He already does. Otherwise, you'd have an infinite regression of causes. Who caused this and who caused this? But he, being eternal and self-existent, I am. And I am the one who was and who is and the one who will be. And so we have that understanding. Then we move on to this option 3, that God does exist. But what kind of God are we talking about? You see, again, we're using cause-effect reasoning, concluding that the natural universe points beyond itself to an eternal being for its existence. So the argument from the cosmos is essentially a cosmological argument, which says, again, as we've just been describing, that the cosmos requires some kind of basis for its beginning, because it's not a necessary entity. It's a contingent system. Now, is this being, but if it's an eternal being, is it personal or impersonal? Now we focus from the universe to specific creation. Well, what cause would be sufficient to explain these effects, order and design in the universe? Secondly, the personality of man. And then third, our moral consciousness. And so the argument from design, the teleological design, telos means an end or a goal, it's built upon the order and predictability of the universe, and design implies a designer. We think teleologically in all areas of life. But the evolutionary, the neo-Darwinian supposition, though, has no basis for any telos, for no basis for anticipatory things and goods, because essentially what you're dealing with mutations and natural selection. You can't anticipate, oh, this mutation is not beneficial now, but several generations down it will be. That's cheating. It's giving a mind to a telos. It doesn't work that way. It's not as substantive as people might suppose. Indeed, complexity is always evidence of a designer, and we see the complexity of a cell, but it just staggers the imagination. It's more complex than anything we'll ever be able to create. And you have about 100 trillion of these, and each one of them is beyond anything that we can even begin to imagine. So if you weigh the evidence, what is the better approach to take? Whether a naturalistic or physicalistic or materialistic view that says that there's no design that produced design, that mindlessness produced mind, that accident produced the intentionality, that the non-life produced the life, that purposeless brings the personal. You see the obvious problem. No, the effect cannot be greater than the cause. So it requires then effectively this: for design is produced. So instead of no design is produced by the designer. Mind produces the minor. The effect is not greater than the cause. So that the cause, if it's design and mind and deliberate, those are qualities of an agency that's intelligent, that has consciousness and awareness and intentionality and purpose, and is a relational being, an intentional being, and is a source and wellspring of order and foundation of life. The argument from humanity, the anthropological argument, is our personality, that we have a mind, will, and emotion. And again, the impersonal doesn't have the ability to think, feel, or choose. So that it would again be inferior to the effect. The argument from thought is another one that says it's a self-defying notion that to say that you're a product of these random stochastic processes. The human mind cannot be that, because it would be self-defeating. It'd be like trying to use your mind to say that I can't use my mind. And so the idea that you're depending upon consciousness and logical thought, even though your system denies the actual idea of consciousness and logical thought and just reduces us to a nothing buttery of matter and energy, doesn't work. We are capable of thinking about the future and thinking about the future. And from aesthetics, the argument is that a personal God is the only adequate explanation of the universal aesthetic experience in humanity, because you and I are bearers of the Imago Dei. And therefore, because God is the wellspring of beauty, we too are aesthetic beings. Because he's the wellspring of all that is good, we are moral beings. Because he's the fountainhead of all that is true, we are rational beings. And because he is a relational being, he's a community being, the one, the three, and the many. As a consequence, we bearing his image are relational beings. In fact, it's the only ontological basis for relationship is a Trinitarian theology, because you cannot have relationships with an I relationship. There'd be an I. You need to have more than one person for there to be love. And so this is not sufficient. And so then we go on and make the clear point from morality. And that moral consciousness requires a personal being to have any ultimate meaning. Again, morality requires a moral founder, moral standard. And of course, if God exists, then we have a problem. So what provides an eternal, personal, ethical God? It's the only sufficient cause of the universe, order and design within the universe, our personality, and that no one can live consistently with a philosophy that rules out meaning, value, and purpose. They will live better. It's not absolute, but sufficient proof, and I think beyond a reasonable doubt, and there are many other evidences that we can see. But there's also, it's not just neutral. Agnosticism is non-decision, but if God exists, agnosticism is eternally unwise, because you gain nothing and lose everything. Biblically, agnosticism is not the process of reserving a judgment, but rather of suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, so that the wrath of God is revealed against those for whom it was already evident because God made it that way. And so it's external and also internal evidences. So the invisible attributes, his eternal power, divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they're without excuse. The proper response then is, without faith, it's impossible to please him. Ultimately, we have to give up the illusion that we can know better than the world's supposed to be like. The faith in the person and work of Jesus Christ, the one who is the one who created it, is the one who is also the one who entered it. And so the inspired word reveals that the infinite word became the incarnate word, so that he could become the indwelling word. It's an incredible concept. So given that notion, then, to summarize, it's unreasonable because it requires omniscience. If no God, then there's no ultimate purpose. Weight of evidence is in favor, and the universe is not eternal, that this being must be personal, internal, because an impersonal being cannot create human thought or morality. And Christ is the clearest manifestation of God in human history. This is another discussion.